So the CIA was a brand new organization post-World War II. It was actually created by a bunch of Yale graduates. It wasn't created by the United States government. Tehran had become the center for all CIA operations in Asia. So it was the headquarters for stuff that was going on in China. It was the headquarters for stuff that was going in Southeast Asia, in India. Wherever the CIA was operating in Asia, Tehran was the headquarters.
Yes, Trump is giving them 5 days, but I mean, there's always the likelihood that in 24 hours or in 48 hours or in 72 hours, the Israelis will do something completely crazy again. And then,
100%.
And I mean, that's the likelihood of that is quite high.
In January of 2002, George Bush Jr. gave the State of the Union address. And he said there is an axis of evil that goes from North Korea to Iran to Iraq. Mossadegh has big dreams. He wants to democratize Iran.
How does Khomeini, this cleric who's in France or goes to France in exile, end up being on top of that revolution?
Israel is so unhinged and so out of control. Reagan believed that the American public had an irrational hatred of war that the Vietnam War had created. It was a disaster. The low numbers are 750,000 Iranians died and 250,000 Iraqis died over the course of the 8 years. It's probably double that.
Why that nuclear deal was so important, what some of its details were, and how stupid it was of Trump to tear up. Tell us, when did oil get discovered in Iran and what's happened with it since then?
Okay, so at the end of the 19th century, the British ran into a problem. And the problem they ran into was they had an oil company. It was Shell. And Shell actually had started off as an antique dealer and somehow ended up in the oil industry. So there were basically three big oil companies on planet Earth. Standard Oil from the United States, Royal Dutch, which was the company from the Netherlands, and then Shell, which was the British corporation. Royal Dutch bought Shell. And when they did, they ended up with 51% of the company, which meant that Shell was no longer really British. And it meant that the British Empire, the most powerful empire on Earth up to that time, right? The US Empire is obviously more powerful, but the British Empire was the most powerful empire ever up until that moment, didn't have its own oil company. And, you know, it's the end of the 19th century. Coal is still the major energy source, but the British realized oil was going to replace coal. So they didn't like that, and they decided they had to fix it. So the way you looked for oil at the time was you walked around and stared at your feet. If you got lucky, you could step in it because there was so much oil, it would literally bubble up to the surface. But mostly what you were looking for was black shale or black sandstone because those are porous stones. And if there's oil underneath, it'll suck it up and turn black. And so the British realized having somebody walk around the planet looking at their feet was not a practical way to look for oil. So what they decided to do instead was look through history books for references to oil usage. And they realized that the medieval Middle East used oil to light up their streets at night, oil lamps, and then also they had grenades, the glass balls that they put oil into, they were using in combat. And then the Roman Empire had flamethrowers, and they were using oil in their flamethrowers. So the British decided, okay, there's oil in the Middle East, that's where we'll start looking. And they carved Kuwait out of the Ottoman Empire, and then used Kuwait as sort of their base of operations for looking for oil. By this point, they'd already had the Trucial Coast, Bahrain, Qatar. Trucial Coast is today UAE, for 80 years. They wanted to get closer to Mesopotamia, to Iran, because they figured that's where the oil was. And they almost immediately after they carved Kuwait out, 1 year later, 1901, they went to the Qajars, who were the rulers of Iran, and got a great oil deal. And they created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The oil deal was that they would get 84% concession, and then the Qajars would take 16%. So normally it's a 50-50 split. And reason is, right, it's Iran's oil, but the English found it, and the English are doing the hard work to get it out of the ground. So you split it 50-50. But the Qajars were really addicted to British opium, and right, the British Empire had a virtual monopoly on opium production. The British Empire started with tobacco and then worked their way to opium. They were the great drug dealer empire of the world. And the Gujars wanted that opium to keep flowing. So they made the deal. They were also probably just high. They also probably had no idea what oil was. And they were not the smartest rulers the world has ever seen. Just like the United States today is the argument against democracy, the Gujars back then were the argument against monarchy. Right? So both systems have a terrible flaw in that they can produce awful leaders. So the Gujars make the deal, and just within a few years, the English find oil in Khuzestan. Khuzestan is the southwest part of Iran. It is Arab majority. It's flat. It's hot. It's humid. It's the hard probably the hardest part of Iran to live in, and that's where the oil was. And so the English then began pulling that oil up out of the ground. Shortly afterwards, actually, the Ottoman Empire found oil in what is today Iraqi Kurdistan, so near Mosul. And when they found oil, the British quickly ran to negotiate with them because they wanted both oil sources. And the Turks decided that Germany was their friend, and so they made a deal with Germany instead, which infuriated the British. But the British were like, well, when you ship it down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we'll just use Kuwait as a military base of operations and shut down those ships if there's ever a war. And that's exactly what happened in World War I. So shortly after the British find oil and start pumping it out of the ground, the Gujars basically go down in a ball of flames because there's a pro-democracy movement in Iran. That pro-democracy movement tries to create basically a modern state to replace this sort of medieval, antiquated monarchy that the Gujars represented. And the British realized that if they pull this off, if Iran does, create a parliament that's the will of the people will realize that this 84-16 concession is awful, and they'll come back and force the British to renegotiate. And the British don't want that to happen. So what they decide to do is overthrow Iran's fledgling democracy. And the way they do it is they make contact with clerics in Iran. The clerics can't wait to work with the British because they don't want a democracy either. And then they contact the Russians, who had colonial aspirations in Iran. And they convince the Russians to invade from the north. They invade from the south. The clerics do their magic. And before you know it, it takes a few years, but the Iranian experiment with democracy goes down in a ball of flames. In the aftermath of this, Reza Pahlavi, not to be confused with the current Reza Pahlavi, it's his grandfather, becomes the new Shah of Iran. And so Iran ends up as a monarchy instead of a democracy. He by the way, in the beginning, he was open to the possibility that it wasn't going to go that direction.
So just for clarity here, so this is like post World War I, like 1920s.
No, it's actually before World War I when he ends up. Yeah, but he ends up in a powerful position before World War I. After World War I is when he becomes the Shah.
Okay,
you're right. So he consolidates his power. It takes a few years for him to consolidate power. He finally consolidates his power. And then what ends up happening is he decides to launch Iran into a modernization program. He believes that Iran has just been held back for too many decades, and he begins this modernization. And, he would like to get a hold of that oil if it's possible, but he knows better than to try because he knows how he got into power to begin with. The year in my head for him, like completely consolidating his power, is 1927, but I'm probably wrong. But I don't know why it's in my head even. So now we advance a little bit further and get to World War II. In 1941, Germany attacks the Soviet Union, and by that point the British had been fighting World War II for 2 years. One of those years by themselves. And I guess technically China was also fighting by themselves. So there were two guys on opposite ends of the world fighting World War II by themselves. And so what ends up happening is the British want a way to get supplies to the Russians and resources to the Russians that's safe. And the path that you would have taken would have been to go north of Norway and then, end up in northern Russia. But the British don't want to use that too often because the Germans have occupied Norway. And the reason the Germans occupied Norway was they anticipated that at some point they would fight the Soviet Union. They wanted to block the British from being able to trade with the Soviet Union. So the British and the Russians decide to invade Iran. And when they do, they contact the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, Reza Shah. They contact his son and say, hey, we're going to overthrow your dad. How do you feel about that? And the son's like, yeah, this is great. I don't have to wait for the guy to die. I can just take over and run the show myself. So they invade when the Russians and the British invade again, right? This is their second invasion into Iran. They split the state in half. They build a highway from the south to the north so that you can move goods across quickly. And they overthrow Reza Shah. He initially ends up in the Seychelles. He dies, I think, in South Africa in the end, but he's basically retired out. And then his son becomes the ruler. Well, it becomes a constitutional monarchy. So it's a system similar to the British, although the Shah had more power than the king does. But the idea was that there was going to be a parliament, and then the parliament would make the legislative decisions, and then the Shah would okay it. In any case, that's how he ends up in power. In 1950, he appoints as prime minister a guy named Mossadegh. Mossadegh has big dreams. He wants to democratize Iran. He wants to move in the direction of Great Britain, where the monarch is going to be more of a figurehead, and the real power is going to be with the Majlis, the parliament. And he also wants to get that oil, because he believes that any type of modernization program that Iran's going to do, it needs to have access to its own oil resources. So he kicks the British embassy out. And the reason he kicks the British embassy out is that's where you put your spies, because they have diplomatic immunity. So he kicks the British embassy out in anticipation of the British trying to overthrow his government. And when he does this, he then nationalizes the oil company, which, by the way, had renamed itself the National Iranian Oil Company because Iran had gone from being Persia to Iran. And then he renames it the National Iranian Oil Company, which is still the name of the national corporation, the government-controlled Iranian Oil Corporation today. He renames it that, and he dumps the British concession, which drives the Brits crazy because they're like, God gave us the earth so we could plunder it and pillage it. And here they're losing their 84-16 concession.
Okay, so before we move ahead, because I guess we know what's coming up, is that Mossadegh will soon be overthrown in a coup. Just there's two questions I want to ask, and you can kind of lead into each other, which I'll just get them out of the way, and then you can go ahead and speak for as long as you like. So the thing is, from 1901 to 1945, when there's concessions in place, or until I guess 1950, where it's 84-16, just what kind of a country is Iran from an economic perspective and a social perspective? Like, is it liberal? Is it conservative? How Muslim is it? How Islamic is it? How developed is it? That's one question. And then the other one is, why does the Shah appoint Mossadegh in 1950? I'm sure by then he's got sort of a movement behind him. He's ran an election of sorts. Like, what's the move that gets him? Why does the Shah say in 1950, okay, Mossadegh, you my prime minister?
Yeah, okay, great questions. So in 1500, Iran made the Safavids take over, and the Safavids make the decision that they want to be Muslim, but they want to have a dividing line between them and the majority of the Arab population. And the reason is the Safavids feared, and rightly so, that the Arabic language might replace the Persian language. And so they thought one way to make sure that didn't happen was to sort of do a little bit of a miniature break. And the way they did it was they switched from being Sunni to Shia. And then that way, Persian nationalism and then a religious divide would help preserve the Persian language. it totally worked. Today, Iran still has a vibrant Persian language. You look at other Arab states like Egypt, ancient Egyptian is gone, right? The Berbers are a minority in North Africa. So, the Persians weren't wrong in fearing the loss of their language. Having said that, Persia ended up in a really strange situation because it was just powerful enough and just economically developed enough that Europeans never successfully invaded it, conquered it, and colonized it like they did essentially almost the entire rest of the world, right? There's just a tiny number of states that avoided European conquest. Iran was invaded twice, but it wasn't colonized. Thailand is another one. Japan, both the Portuguese and the Dutch tried to get into Japan, but they didn't really get into Japan. They traded with it. And then, of course, Korea, but the Japanese conquered Korea. So I guess poor Korea still got conquered. But everywhere else, Liberia was a U.S. colony in the sense that it was where freed slaves could go if they didn't want to stay in the United States. So I guess Liberia was technically never conquered, but the rest of the world was conquered. And so Turkey, I guess, also, but the Ottoman Empire was destroyed by the Europeans, but Turkey wasn't colonized. So Iran was just powerful enough it could avoid that. And the British Empire knew it would never be able to take Iran unless it had Russia take the northern half. They would have to divide and conquer it. So the Sykes-Picot plan that the British had put into place, which was to take over Iran, was that the British would take southern Iran and the Russians would take northern Iran. But when the Russians had the communist revolution and created this communist state, the British found themselves in a position where they couldn't invade Iran. So having said all that, Iran wasn't anywhere near as developed as Europe. It was definitely stronger economically and militarily than the average non-European state, but it didn't have the kind of development. It had enormous poverty, poor roads, terrible infrastructure. It was not a fully modern society in this time period. So that's why Reza Shah and then later Mossadegh are so keen to do these modernization programs.
Okay, and then coming back to Mossadegh, yeah.
My understanding of the situation with Mossadegh was that the Shah wanted to modernize Iran. He thought Mossadegh was the guy that was going to pull that off. And I think he also believed that Mossadegh was really popular with the people. He was too popular to ignore him anymore. So it's sort of one of those situations where if you don't appoint him, there could be consequences. If you appoint him, maybe he'll be your man. And so the Shah puts him in. And I think the Shah also wanted that concession gone, right? Like he knew that the British were going to do everything they could to keep that concession in place. But I think at the end of the day, he was hoping Mossadegh would pull this off. So the British are stuck. They can't do a coup. They want to do a coup, but they don't have the ability to do it because their embassy was shut down. In 1952, 2 years later, it's a presidential election in the United States. One of the candidates is Dwight David Eisenhower, who, of course, had been the military commander for the European theater of operation for all allies except for the Soviets. So, he was the general in charge of Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery. So he was in charge of the British forces. And I think that fact bonded him strongly to the British, but also the other way around. The British felt strongly bonded to him as well. So during the election, they actually approached him and they said, when you win, because I don't think anybody believed Adlai Stevenson could beat him, when you win, we need you, the United States, to overthrow Mossadegh. And Eisenhower said, yeah, of course, I'm happy to do it. So he wins the election and then he mobilizes the CIA. So the CIA was a brand new organization post-World War II. It was actually created by a bunch of Yale graduates. It wasn't created by the United States government. And when they created it, their idea was that they would create basically a spy network, a hit team network of experts. They would be experts on specific countries who would work for U.S. corporations to advance U.S. corporate interests. And they went to the United States government and they said, there are two ways this can roll out. You can fund us and have a say in what we do, or you cannot fund us and we're going to do whatever we want to whenever we want to. And the U.S. government decided, okay, I guess we're going to fund you because we'd like to have a say in what you do. In 1949, the CIA sort of got to practice its first run at this and overthrew the fledgling democracy in Syria. Syria had been a democracy for all of 3 years, and they overthrew al-Quwatli. And it plunged Syria into 9 years of just crazy chaos. Syria had like 11 different leaders in that 9-year span of time, and it was just coup after coup. One of those leaders came in again, so he was twice. And al-Quwatli came in at the end, so he was twice as well. And the way the Syrians stabilized the state was by having Egypt annex it. But that's how bad that coup d'etat was for Syria. They couldn't function anymore. They needed somebody to come in from outside. So we knew, because we had watched Syria plunge into chaos for 4 years. We knew the consequences of doing a coup d'etat in Iran, that it potentially could go really badly. And so we did it. Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, was the CIA operative in Iran. What he did was he went and got a group of military guys and told them that he wanted to do a coup d'etat. They agreed. And they went to Mossadegh's house at 3 a.m., early in the morning, and knocked on the front door. And Mossadegh answers the door. He's in his pajamas with his nightcap on. And they go, "You're under arrest." And he said, No, you're under arrest. And they're like, "What do you mean?" And Mossadegh had his security in front, and they just simply stood up and arrested the coup organizers. Kermit Roosevelt had been down the road watching from a distance, and so he sees his guys get arrested, and he takes off running and he escapes. And he's now on the run. When Eisenhower hears about this, he orders the CIA to shut down the operation. He's like, "We don't need this to turn into an international incident. Please stop the operation." So the CIA continues the operation because that's who they are. And Kermit Roosevelt then meets with Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of the general who was in charge of the Iraqi invasion for the U.S. In the 1991. Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. was a businessman who had a lot of dealings in the Middle East. So he knew Iranians and he knew Iranian society. And so Kermit goes to him and says, "What can I do?" And Schwarzkopf comes up with this brilliant idea. Why don't you go hire the day laborers and literally pay them to do a pro-Mossadegh protest? And then at the end of the Mossadegh protest, have them attack the stores and loot. Just, throw rocks through the store windows and steal stuff. Because what that'll do is it'll show up on the TV, people will hear about it on the radio, they'll read about it in the newspaper, and they'll be appalled. It'll turn people against Mossadegh, but most importantly, it'll turn the bazaris against Mossadegh, the store owners, because that was the core of the Iranian economy, was the merchant class. And so that's what Kermit Roosevelt does. He takes bags of CIA money and he's just distributing it out to the day laborers and has them do these pro-Mossadegh protests where they're chanting his name, and then they end it by looting. And they do this day after day after day, and eventually the military steps in and does a coup d'etat because the military can't see a way out. The bazaris are demanding that Mossadegh be overthrown. The people have turned against him, and he's put under house arrest. And that's the end of his 3-year prime ministership.
Okay, so what happens in the immediate aftermath of that? I mean, he's overthrown. The Shah is reinstalled, but he kind of is already installed. Like, is there a change in who the Shah is? Like, what goes on after that?
Yeah, so the Shah goes from heading towards being more of a figurehead to becoming an absolute monarch. he uses the opportunity to dramatically increase his power and then reduce the power of the Majlis. And it's a brilliant political maneuver on his part. It'll have a nasty consequence for Iran long term, though, and that is that he doesn't really like political dissent. So if you're too loud and criticize his government too much, you'll end up in political prison. And little by little, people then begin to feel that he's a tyrant because he's putting too many people in political prison. When you compare him to the Islamic Republic that exists today, he looks like just a lovely guy that you want to have a picnic with. But in that moment, when the world felt like, people celebrated democracy and people were moving towards a more liberal society, it was really strange to have this guy being so heavy-handed. What was the other part of your question?
He kind of like handpicks Mossadegh, obviously because Mossadegh's a popular figure. And I guess part of that is, yes, because Mossadegh will try to nationalize Iran's oil, which is good for Iran, but also it's kind of like to pacify the public. So the public feels that this is a Shah who cares a bit about them and, he's a good figurehead. And then obviously when Mossadegh's removed, that's now no longer his problem and he can now grab the state, right? And he does that. And then, you mentioned that, it becomes autocratic and it becomes creepingly autocratic. And we'll get into that, I guess, when we get to the 70s with Savak and some of the stuff they did. But just at the outset, like, how does it fundamentally, is it just like Mossadegh's a blip and then the Shah comes back and there was a general direction? Or does the Shah now start taking Iran in a new direction post Mossadegh?
Yeah, so he does take Iran in a new direction to the shock and dismay of the British. Instead of putting Iran back into the British sphere and turning over Iranian oil to the British, which, by the way, after it becomes a national Iranian oil company, the Anglo-Iranian oil company becomes BP, British Petroleum. So that's the birth of British Petroleum. So in that moment, then the U.S. steps in, and basically Eisenhower makes a deal with the Shah. I'll support your rise to absolute monarchy. In return, you become part of the U.S. sphere of influence instead of the British sphere of influence. One of the things the British didn't count on was that part of the Eisenhower doctrine was, Truman was all about, we have to stop communism at any means. It's spreading and we need to block it. Eisenhower thought, no, that's really not that important. We'll do it when it's convenient. For Eisenhower, he had two real objectives. The first one was to disassemble the British and French empires and then replace them. So this was one of those steps. The British thought he was doing them a favor by overthrowing Mossadegh and got a big surprise. The other part was he feared that there was the possibility of an Arab Union. And so Eisenhower put a lot of energy into trying to prevent that Arab Union from forming. So in 1958, when Syria and Egypt merge, Eisenhower invades Lebanon in an attempt to show the world the Arab world, that he's not going to tolerate too much unity. Lebanon was on the verge of also joining with Syria and Egypt, and so is Iraq. And the invasion of Lebanon convinces Iraq and Lebanon not to do it. The reason that matters is because then if Iran is now in the U.S. sphere of influence, it's going to join a different organization than the organization that Nasser was part of. So Nasser was taking Egypt in the direction of trying to create Arab unity, but he was also part of the non-alignment movement with Tito of Yugoslavia and Nehru of India. And, Sukarno was part of this. Kwame Nkrumah was part of this. This was a big global movement that ended up with more members than NATO and Warsaw Pact combined. And so the United States created then a counterbalance for it. And that counterbalance was called the Baghdad Pact, and it included Iraq until 1958 anyway, and it included Iran. And the idea behind it was it would be an anti non-alignment movement pact, and that Iran would then be at the center of this. They called it the Baghdad Pact because they wanted Iraq to be a part of it, but the idea was Iran would be at the center of it, and it would help keep Arabs from unifying by any means that it had available, and at the same time push back against Nehru and Tito and Nasser's plans for not participating in the Cold War, right? That was the whole idea behind the non-alignment pact. Non-alignment movement was that the Cold War was this fabricated, nonsensical event, and they didn't want to be victims of it. And there was fear that it would be an excuse for U.S. imperialism, and they were not wrong. In any case, that's the deal that the Shah makes with the United States, and Iran ends up culturally going in a very liberal direction, and it goes too far. That's the human tendency, right? We pendulum swing, and instead of trying to find some kind of moderate space, we end up going to one of the extremes. Iran ends up so far culturally that I'm pretty sure it became the largest consumer of chlorine on the planet. Everybody had blonde hair and then nose jobs. I think every cosmetic surgeon on the planet got their training in Iran. Everybody ends up with nose jobs because they want to have a European style looking nose. And this becomes, it becomes so prevalent in Iranian culture that it got nicknames, like the shopping mall of the Middle East was one. Little United States was another one. Gagouche, whose music, by the way, I love. So this isn't a bash on Gagouche, but one of her albums in the 70s shows her wearing a cowboy hat, wearing cowboy boots, pistols on her hips. She's dressed as a cowgirl. And, it's cute, but at the same time, it also shows the extent to which that pendulum swing towards U.S. culture and everything U.S. had gone. It had gone so far that some people began to see it as toxic, and it pushed Iranian nationalism in the other direction. And there was a portion of the population that began to say, wait a minute, no, we're Iranian. We have an old culture. It's 2,800 years old. Why are we adopting U.S. cultural features when we have our own culture? And so that's the pendulum swing that's going to go flying in the other direction.
Okay, what specifically happens with the oil? I mean, up until what Mosdek tries to dismantle is the 84-16 concession, and then post Mosdek, I guess the U.S. acquires a part of that British concession. But I mean, maybe it's a more complicated structure. But just roughly, what's your understanding? What happens to the oil after that?
Yeah, so U.S. oil companies do move into the region, but the NIOC is still in charge. Like they don't. I don't know what kind of split they had in terms of profit margins, but at the end of the day, Iran never really released its oil back completely. The United States and even the British, to a degree, had access to that oil and definitely were participating in developing oil fields, et cetera. But it still remained a national project, so it never went back to anything resembling the.
Okay, so I mean, so the difference is the Shah now is pointing in America's direction, but now he has a lot more oil revenue, which the previous anyone in charge between 1901 and 1950 did not have. So Iran becomes a more established state, a bigger state. I'm guessing there's a bunch of infrastructure projects, all those kind of things. Now, there's two reasons, which just from what you're saying, but also my understanding, why the resistance to the Shah occurs. The one is he's moved to autocracy. Savak, the Secret Service, is really, there's a lot of infamous stories about their brutality. Like you say, it's nothing compared to perhaps how, what the Assads were doing in Syria, what Saddam was doing in Iraq, and what eventually in various blips, what the Iranian theocracy does, because it has moments where it's less brutal and moments where it's more brutal.
That's true.
But the thing is, and then the other one is it's this cultural move away from Persia. Two things: the ancient Persia, which and because the Shah also tries to redefine like a more superficial version of Persia, but there's the move towards Persia, and then I guess the move away from like Shia cultural Islam, right? Which results in some sort of revolution. But then thirdly, because I kind of want to build the atmosphere of the 70s, is that those who are opposing the autocracy also are looking to more modern ways, not to Shia Islam, but socialism and leftism.
That's true.
Right? So how does that kind of foment in this revolutionary environment that now exists in the 70s, and how does Khomeini, this cleric who's in France or goes to France in exile, end up being on top of that revolution?
Yeah. So You're right. There's multiple movements going on in Iran. There's a nationalist movement, there's a religious backlash movement, and then there's also a leftist movement, which includes socialists and communists. And they're hoping, the socialists and communists are hoping to, break Iran out of the Shah's grip and then either become a Soviet ally or go it their own way, do something very similar to what Nasser did with Egypt. The communists are thinking they're going to probably end up being Soviet allies. The socialists want to do something more like Egypt. And they're divided, of course. The case of the Muslim fundamentalist wing of this movement, a lot of them ended up in prison. A lot of them ended up tortured. It's a rough time for that movement. Khomeini ends up going to France at one point, and then he ends up in Iraq. As it becomes clear that the Shah is finished, he even leaves the country. He leaves the country for medical treatment, but by that point, he's done. Right? There's nothing he can do to stop the revolution. Once he gets to that point, the United States now fears that the communists are going to win. And because they feared that the communists were going to win, they thought, it would be a huge victory for the Soviet Union if they could get Iran as an ally. It would be devastating for the United States' interest in the Middle East, but it would be a very big positive for the Soviet Union, not only because of oil, but then technically that highway that the British and the Russians built could then be a way that the Russians could get goods out into the world. The Persian Gulf is the center of the old world. It's basically halfway between Spain and China. It's basically halfway between South Africa and Korea. Like it's a great location. And if you wanted to trade with the world, coming out through the Persian Gulf would be a fantastic location to do it from. So the United States decided if we can't keep Iran, then we need to make sure the Soviet Union doesn't get Iran. And so at that point, Khomeini is released from Iraq. Iraq had been acting as a U.S. proxy ally and goes into Iran. And the goal behind letting him go into Iran is that he'll flip Iran fundamentalist, that the Islamists will win out over the communists once the government is toppled. And so there was this brief period where it wasn't, once the revolution got going, it wasn't clear which direction it was going to go, whether communist or fundamentalist or something else. There was a women's protest that actually took place where women went out on the streets to make sure that their rights were being defended. And I've seen film footage of it, and it's sort of eerie because it's this moment, what's coming, but at the same time, what they just had. And like they're in the street and they faced a lot of threats, and it becomes basically the last time the women went in the streets like that until more recent times. And then, in the end, the communists have to flee. The military has to flee. The Islamists win out. They take over the government and they capture a bunch of generals. They execute them. They mass execute the generals. Air Force generals had an easy way out. They just literally flew out. Some of the admirals get caught and executed. Some of them escape. It's a mess. The communists are falling over each other to try to get out of the country because they know that if they stay, they'll be executed. And, a group of them get caught. Some of them end up out. Just full disclosure, I've definitely met several of the communists over the course of my life who got out. In any case, once the Islamic Republic is established, it really was a republic. It had free and fair elections, but with caveats in place. To run for office, you had to be cleared. You had to go through a process of being approved to make sure you fit the criteria. So that there was basically a group of clerics who would say yes or no. But once you got through that clearance, the elections in the beginning, at least, were generally considered to be pretty free and fair, and that ended up making Iran kind of a unique experiment because it really was a democratic theocracy in the beginning, but it's since definitely devolved and is no longer democratic in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, so you go for it. Continue.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that does take away from the democracy aspect of it, the democracy angle, was that Khomeini became the supreme leader. So it's the opposite of the British. The president of Iran is symbolic. The Majlis, the parliament, is symbolic. The supreme leader is the true leader. Whereas the king is a figurehead. It's flipped. But the elections were definitely free and fair in the beginning.
Okay, so that period is quite short, and I mean, I think, and it's changed because of what we call the supreme leader, or what Khomeini institutes as this new idea of Vilayat-e-Faqih, right? But I think the other very substantial thing that obviously that allows him to maybe actualize and manifest Vilayat-e-Faqih is the Iran-Iraq war, and that also kind of sets.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's two events. There's one precedes the Iran-Iraq war, which is obviously during the revolution, the embassy, the American embassy is seized and captured and retained under Iran's control for a very long period of time, and we can talk about that. But those two events kind of set this new theocracy under the path of consistently tending towards more autocracy and consistently tending towards American isolationism. Obviously, the way the U.S. responds to it doesn't help it. Right, because it foments that by funding the Iran-Iraq war. It foments it with consistent sanctions, with never trusting the Ayatollahs, with never trusting any reform presidents as such. But before we go down that road, just talk us through how the embassy capture, right, for lack of a better word, and the Iran-Iraq war. What happens there, and how does that set Iran down this path of anti-Americanism, America is shaitan, but also how does it entrench Vilayat-e-Faqih, or this idea that Khomeini is the supreme leader?
Okay, so during the revolution, or I guess in the aftermath of the initial phase of the revolution, a group of students decide to storm the U.S. embassy. They're college students. And the reason they want to storm the U.S. embassy is because they believe that the proof that the United States overthrew their democracy in 1953 will be there. And they want the United States to apologize for it. So the students are heading to the embassy. The government, the fledgling revolutionary government, literally calls the embassy on the phone, and they're like, get out. We have a group of students marching towards you. They're going to capture the embassy. We really don't want this to be an international incident. If you're not there, it's a lot better for everybody. And their attitude is, if we shoot the students or try to stop them, we don't know what happens to the revolution, so we can't. We have to let them do this, but you could just not be there. But the 50 or so guys who are still there, because most of the embassy staff did escape. Some of them, had already left. Some of them escaped to the Canadian embassy. The guys who stayed behind, the reason they stayed behind is they were CIA operatives whose job it was to destroy the documents that were in the embassy that would prove, for example, that they had in fact done a coup d'etat in 1953. But it was way more than that. Tehran had become the center for all CIA operations in Asia. So it was the headquarters for stuff that was going on in China. It was the headquarters for stuff that was going in Southeast Asia, in India. Wherever the CIA was operating in Asia, Tehran was the headquarters. So they had all the documents for everything they had been doing, plus all the locations and names of the spies and where they were operating and what their mission was. So the CIA just couldn't evacuate the embassy. They needed to destroy those documents. So they're literally just sitting there shredding them when the students climb the walls and enter the embassy. For the record, an embassy is the sovereign territory of the state that is represented. So in that moment, it is an international incident, because in that moment, those students have literally entered the United States of America and are, trespassing, but on an embassy which was considered like a semi-sacred thing. Obviously, it's not truly sacred because the United States doesn't believe it's a sacred thing. But anyway, this was an international incident, but it wasn't like they had captured legitimate embassy staff. They had captured the CIA operatives in the embassy. So then when they capture them, they tie them up and they take the documents, the shredded documents, and they just go to nearby middle schools and high schools, and they empty out garbage bags of these documents, and they go, "You guys like to make puzzles, right?" And those kids sit there and put the shredded documents back together. And once they do, they make copies of them and they distribute them free to anybody who wants them. It's a devastating blow to U.S. CIA operations throughout Asia, because they literally have to call back their operatives. So the United States does have grounds for complaining, but at the same time, the complaint is, "Oh, you caught us red-handed," and it included all the documents for 1953, where it details out exactly what Kermit Roosevelt did. So what I'm saying isn't coming from anybody's mouth. It's coming from the CIA's mouth. It's coming from Kermit Roosevelt, because we can read those documents because the Iranians made them public. In any case, those students then asked the United States to do a formal apology. Basically, the attitude the students had was, if you guys say you're sorry for 53, we'll let your CIA operatives go. And Jimmy Carter wanted nothing to do with this. He just, he got some things right, especially as an ex-president. But as president, he felt like if he ate this crow, it would just be devastating to U.S.'s public image. So he just didn't want to apologize. He didn't want to admit that the United States had overthrown the Iranian government in 1953. So he refused, and that's why the Iran hostage crisis dragged on and on and on and on. And one of the things it did is it captured the imagination of the American public. So there are people in the U.S. who were glued to their TV, and every day they would start with a ticker how many days those guys had been held captive. And Nightline, a whole news program was created just around the hostage crisis thing. It evolved into something else over time, but initially it was, basically just a ticker for what's happening with the hostage crisis. I remember, because I was a kid back then, I remember there was a huge amount of anti-Iranian hatred that was being fomented. I was living in Denver, and the Coptic Orthodox Church, Coptic Orthodox religion is the Christian religion in Egypt, got bombed. And the reason is somebody thought that the Coptic Orthodox Church was Iranian, because they obviously went to American public schools, and couldn't differentiate between the two. But that was the extent to which you're seeing this anti-Iranian hatred fomenting. Is there were people actually in the United States committing acts of terror against what they perceived to be Iranian targets. And then Rafsanjani, one of the top clerics, one of the most powerful men in Iran, really until he died. Obviously, after the Green Movement in 2009, a lot of his power was eroded because he took the side of the reformers. But he was really powerful and in a really strong position. He went to the students and began negotiating, because the Islamic Republic wanted this crisis ended. And it seemed very likely he was going to get a deal. And so once word got back to the United States that Rafsanjani was probably going to get the students to let the hostages go, people from the Reagan campaign got on an airplane and flew to Iran. And they went to Rafsanjani's office, knocked on his door, and his secretary let him in. And they set a couple of suitcases filled with money on his desk, and they said, what would it take for you not to release the hostages? And Rafsanjani is like, wait a minute, what? I thought you were from the United States. Why wouldn't you want the hostages released? And they said, we're from the Reagan campaign. The election hasn't happened yet. If you release the hostages before the election, Carter will get reelected. If you release the hostages after the election, Reagan will win. It's just that simple. What we need you to do is keep those hostages until at least after the first Tuesday of November. We would love it if you kept them right up until Inauguration Day so that Reagan could get credit for freeing the hostages. And Rafsanjani decided, because we don't know exactly the full extent of the deal, it's pretty obvious there was a money transaction, but he decided that this was useful for Iran, and so he actually broke the negotiations with the students off, and the hostages ended up staying hostage for I think another 6 months, and then Reagan won. Jimmy Carter didn't know that the Reagan guys had gone. Now it's worth pointing out the guys who would have told him that the Reagan guys had gotten on an airplane and flown to Iran probably would have been the CIA, but Reagan's vice presidential candidate was George Bush Sr., who had been the director of the CIA, so it's entirely likely the CIA just simply failed to inform Jimmy Carter of what had transpired. So in Jimmy Carter's mind, he still needed to get the hostages released. He worked on it until noon on January 20th. His last minutes in office was him talking to Iran, trying to convince them to release the hostages. It never occurred to him that he had actually been just completely outmaneuvered. Shortly after the inauguration, that's when the hostages were released. And of course, Reagan went, see, that's what it took. It took me becoming president to get the hostages released. So that's the one part of the story. And then let's go to the Iran-Iraq war. Like how devastating is that for both countries, and how does it begin, and how does it also set Iran on this course collision with the United States? So, if the Islamic Republic had a chance of, avoiding becoming a tyranny, it was in that moment. Reagan wants vengeance. He wants to destabilize Iran. He wants to ruin the Islamic Republic. He's a nationalist who's looking for a war, and he doesn't think he'll do a war with Iran. That's off the table. He knows, like the British did, Iran was too powerful. You don't want to start a war with Iran. The Iranian people are too nationalistic. They're too dedicated to their state. It'll be a nightmare. And we're coming off the Vietnam War. Reagan believed that the American public had an irrational hatred of war that the Vietnam War had created, and he calls it the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome, he thinks, can be cured if the United States can just simply win a war somewhere. But he's thinking proxy war is all you need. He doesn't need to win a direct war, at least in the case of Iran. So what he does is he gives Saddam Hussein, who by that point we had been courting. At one point we gave him a list of 800, the CIA gave him a list of 800 Iraqis that the CIA had deemed undesirable people. And Saddam Hussein had decided he didn't know what to do with the list. They didn't give him any instructions. They went, here's a list of people we don't like that live in your country. And he was like, you know what? I'm going to show the United States that I'm their guy and I can play their game. He mass arrested them. They were professors and engineers and MDs. He mass arrested them and did kangaroo courts where he'd have 30 defendants at a time, find them guilty, and mass executed them on TV, just hanged them. And of course, the CIA was like, this is our guy. We could totally work with him. So the CIA goes to him and says, look, we think you can take Iran. And what we think you can do is carve off the Arab part of Iran and just say that you're liberating it. And it's a nationalistic war. The reason we think you can take Iran is because they literally decapitated the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. And they just don't have, they just came out of this revolution. It took place 2 years ago. They're in chaos. This is a perfect opportunity. And so Iraq makes the terrible mistake of actually believing the CIA and attacks Iran based on that faulty intelligence. So I have, in 2002, I did a battlefield tour of Khuzestan. And the goal of Iraq was to capture Abadan and then from there expand its campaign and capture Dazful and Ahwaz. Because there's going to be some Persian speaker who's going to be mad at me for saying Ahwaz. Ahwaz is the Arabic, Ahvaz is the Persian. But Abadan was the jewel, the gem. it's where the heart of Iran's oil industry is. So if you capture it, you cripple Iran's economy, and it was going to be really painful for Iran to recover. So the Iraqi military captured Khorramshahr, which is to the north of Abadan, and their goal was to swing to the east and basically encircle the city from the east and then come back and attack the city. And they were doing this because they were trying to get around the Karun, which is the river that flows into Iraq and forms the Shatt al-Arab with the Tigris and the Euphrates. And his infantry got a certain distance, and then his tanks got a little bit further, and it turned out the Iranian military wasn't in the kind of shape that he had been led to believe, and they stopped him. And they never captured Abadan. They shelled it. They destroyed much of the oil refining capabilities inside Abadan, but they couldn't capture the city. Then the Iranian military pushed him back to the border, and what ended up happening was 8 years of trench warfare with nothing moving. It just eventually the Iranians captured Fao, which was the southern port city for Iraq. But that was it. There was essentially no movement in the lines. It was very much like a World War I style war. They just dug in and blasted each other. Having said that, the United States was really keen on Iraq winning. So the United States was giving it weapons, it was giving it missiles, it was giving it gas, sarin gas, VX gas, mustard gas. We gave them anthrax. We loaded the Iraqis up with basically every banned chemical weapon and biological weapon. And the Iraqis were definitely using gas. I'm unaware of them using anthrax, but they were 100% using gas weapons. The person who took me on the battlefield tour was an artillery officer, and there was an island in the Shatt al-Arab that his Iranian unit had captured, and they were using it. They were to fire artillery into Iraq. And he said what happened was one day, because he was the commander, he wrote himself a leave, and the leave was for, half a day. And he just he had his car parked on the bank. So the ferry took him to the bank. He got in the car. He drove home because his home was a 2-hour drive away from where the battlefield was. He watched TV and had dinner with his wife and daughter, got back in the car, drove to the bank, and the ferry guy said, your unit's destroyed. And the guy's like, what do you mean? I've been gone for 6 hours. How did my unit get destroyed? And they said, it was gassed while you were gone, and everybody's dead. And this is the kind of warfare that the Iraqis were trying to use. Now, the reason Iraq was this desperate that it was using gas is the Iranians outnumbered them 3-1. So the only way Iraq could prevail in the war was if they fought harder, fought better. And man for man, the Iraqis definitely were a better soldier, but that was largely because of the equipment that the United States had given them. It wasn't because Iraqi morale was higher. If anything, Iranian morale was higher. The Iranians didn't have enough rifles. They didn't have enough boots. They were missing spare parts for their aircraft. The Iranian military was not in great shape, but it was in strong enough shape that it prevented the Iraqis from winning. And it was a disaster. The low numbers are 750,000 Iranians died and 250,000 Iraqis died over the course of the 8 years. It's probably double that. Iraq began a terror campaign where they would fire scuds into Tehran in a Battle of Britain, London Blitz style terror campaign. And it definitely inflicted a bunch of terror, but of course all it did was bolster Iranian resolve to not lose the war. So it didn't work. Terror doesn't work. It's whether I bomb a city with a B-52 or slam it with a drone or a missile or strap bomb to my chest and run into a crowded space, it doesn't make people change their mind. If anything, it usually makes them even more determined to fight you. So it's just a dumb idea that we keep doing over and over and over again. Like, my God, freaking read a book. I don't get it. I don't get why people can't remember what happened. It's like collective amnesia. I know there's some people that remember, but clearly the policymakers aren't in that crowd. In any case, the Iran-Iraq war, as it devolves into this just grind where all it's doing is killing people, it starts to become increasingly clear neither side can win. Despite Iraq using gas weapons. Gas weapons aren't a very effective weapon. They're more of a terror weapon. Obviously, it took out my tour guide's artillery unit. I'm not saying it doesn't cause any harm, but when you compare it to conventional weapons, it's not any more effective. Biologicals, on the other hand, definitely are. So I guess next time, release smallpox. That'll fix the other side. Or bubonic plague or something. So the person that Khamenei becomes, or the leader that he becomes, really is because of Khomeini. So Khomeini, you were trying to get me to go in this direction, and I ended up getting stuck in the minutiae of the war. Khomeini used the Iran-Iraq war to take his position and basically make himself the absolute monarch of Iran. If the Iran-Iraq war hadn't happened, he would probably not have been able to pull that off. And that would have allowed, Iran at the time had a prime minister and a president, that would allow the prime minister, the president, and the Majlis to retain a lot of power. But because of the war, he used it as it's a crisis. We need to navigate through this crisis. We need strong leadership. He put himself in that position. He dies, and that's when Iran decides to not surrender, but reach a deal with Iraq, which basically was, let's just go back to the old borders and forget anything happened. So that's what ends up. By the way, I also, just to add, there was the guy that took me on the battlefield tour. His mother was Iraqi, so his father was Iranian. So he was half Arab, half Persian, living in the Arab part of Iran. He spoke Arabic as fluently as he spoke Persian, and he was on the Iranians. This wasn't a clean war where there's one clear side. It was fragmented. Iran is Shia attacking or fighting Iraq, which attacked it, which was majority Shia. It was a mess. And you're right. What it did was it shifted Iranian identity so that Iranians saw themselves even more as not Arab, right? Because they weren't. But this made it clear because they saw Iraq as Arab, even though it was majority Shia, fighting it. And so it fueled its nationalistic feelings. Okay, so Khomeini dies, Khamenei takes over. Khamenei wasn't actually supposed to be the next Valiyat Afari. They had another guy, and I've been trying to think of his name, and it's not popping in, so we'll just move on. And Khamenei, with help of Rafsanjani and several other guys, outmaneuvers the other guy. The other guy was too, I think, idealistic. He was too good. And in that moment, you wanted somebody who, the person who was going to win that contest for power was the guy who could stab you in the back the best. And that's who Khamenei was. He gets into power, and he's not regarded highly by most people. People loved Khomeini. He was charismatic. He was the guy who came in and saved Iran from Iraq, right? There was this sort of romance. So even people who were not Islamists, who didn't like the Islamic Revolution, still kind of admired the guy at some level. It wasn't, but with Khamenei, there was never any of that kind of love. He just didn't have that kind of charisma, and he didn't have that kind of play. And I think a lot of people also saw him as having cheated to get his position, that he wasn't meant to be the guy that came in. And so he actually was in a little bit of a weak position throughout the 90s. The 90s is like the great letdown decade in contemporary times, because you're right, like Oslo was on the table, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. There was a moment the world had where it could have, if we had had decent leaders in that moment, we could have really reshaped the world to end some of the imperialism and some of the conflicts that were going on. But instead, we had people like George Bush Sr., who decided he was going to blow up Iraq. And his whole goal in blowing up Iraq was to show the world that the United States was a mercenary military that was for hire, and to try to convince the American people that wars aren't that bad. He was part of that group of guys who felt the United States had Vietnam syndrome and needed to be cured. What ends up happening is, if you think about the states in the Middle East as like stacked on top of each other like a Jenga block, like Jenga blocks, then Iraq was pulled out and it destabilized the Middle East. And in that moment, then it allowed Iran to have a lot more influence and authority than it would have had otherwise, because its natural competitor was literally taken out by George Bush Sr. By this point, Iran sees itself as the defender, not just of the Shia, but also of Islam in general. And, the Islamic Republic, when it had the revolution in 79, it sent shockwaves throughout the Middle East. Saudi Arabia changed its laws and became itself basically a theocratic state. And it wasn't until MBS that Saudi Arabia abandoned that position and has been now moving in the other direction. So in even states that didn't go through revolution, I mean, there was an uprising in Saudi Arabia, and I think it just scared everybody. You saw this massive movement towards being more conservative. Egypt, which is a secular state, became suddenly a lot less secular, and you saw this the government become a lot more religiously conservative. So in a way, Iran thought, oh, look at this, we've woken up the conservative elements in Islam, and we're getting people to practice Islam a little bit more seriously. You mentioned Hezbollah. So it wasn't in 82, it wasn't yet called Hezbollah, but obviously it becomes Hezbollah. A group of Iranians literally went to Lebanon at the behest of the government. There's two reasons for this. One was to mobilize the Shia population living in Lebanon. The other reason was to get those guys out of Iran, because they were revolutionaries that didn't know when to stop revolting. And because Tehran had been the CIA operations headquarters, it had minting plates for US dollars. So the CIA would literally counterfeit its own money and then distribute it to rebel armies so that they could buy AK-47s. And when the students captured the embassy, they captured those minting plates. Iran didn't want them, right? Because this is an international disaster if Iran uses those plates to counterfeit US dollars. So they handed them to Hezbollah. And that's how Hezbollah funded its original operations, was counterfeiting $20 bills using the CIA's counterfeiting plates. Like, the irony is terrible and awesome at the same time. So the Islamic Republic sees itself as this bastion of, what Islam should be, defending Muslims, and in the process it starts to ramp up anti-Israel rhetoric. Americans can't wait to talk about how Iran funds Hamas. And I just want to point out, Qatar funds Hamas, and so does the United States, and so does Israel. Like, it's a I think Iran's like number 3 or 4 on the list of funders. It's really actually a much more complicated situation than I think most people realize. But Iran definitely was sending support to its Shia proxies throughout the Middle East. And then it gets a reform movement. In 1997, I almost said 79, in 1997, so 18 years after the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian people elect a guy named Khatami. Khatami is a reformer, and his goal is to get into office as president and gently nudge Iran over so that there aren't the kind of strict rules that had been put in place by Khomeini and Khamenei. So, for example, head cover. What Khomeini wanted was, he wanted it to be a woman's choice. You want to cover your head? Cover your head. You don't want to cover your head? Don't cover your head. It's your choice. And so, that's that was one of the many things he tried to push through, but it was a really big and important symbolic one because it then allowed women autonomy over how they dressed. And so he starts doing these reforms.
Sorry, so you mean Khatami, because you said Khomeini, but I'm assuming you mean Khomeini.
I messed up. Sorry. Yeah. Khatami does these reforms. Khatami even decided to start secret negotiations with the United States. And I think they originally met in Houston, Texas, of all places. Not Khatami, but the people he sent to negotiate. And one of the things that they came up with was, what are the lists of demands the United States has? One of them was apologize for the Iran hostage crisis. Another one was let Coca-Cola back into Iran. And the Iranians were a little baffled. They were like, wait, Coca-Cola? Like, that's your priority? You don't have some other priority? And, and then the Americans, of course, were saying, and at some point we'd like to get our oil companies back into Iran. And, it was all a list of capitalistic demands. So basically the Clinton administration was like, if you will open up your markets so that the United States can go in there and make some dollars off of you, we'll start normalizing relations. And Khatami decided, yeah, let's do it. So he apologizes for the Iran hostage crisis, and he starts letting some American businesses back into the Islamic Republic. And women covering their hair gets loosened up. Like the reforms start to kick in. There was a soccer match in the Tehran stadium, and women hadn't been allowed to go to those soccer matches, but they went. And then Iran and the United States played each other in the 1998 World Cup, and Iran beat the United States. And women poured into the streets, ripped off their hijab, and were twirling it around. And the government was cool with it. They were like, yeah, do it. Let's enjoy this moment. Let's celebrate. And so that was Khatami's time. But he kept reminding the people something really important. And that was, I'm the president, which means my position is largely symbolic. The real guy in power is Khamenei. If you want these reforms to stick, you're going to have to get in the habit of protesting to support me, because I don't have much power and the Majlis doesn't have much power. And so the Iranian people did. They would go into the streets and they would have pro-government rallies to support Khatami, which is, like a little confusing, I think, to most people. But that's, when you think about it, that's how democracy should work. The people should be voicing their position, whether they support the government or oppose the government. You want the people engaged. And the Iranians are very political. When I went in 2002, and everywhere I went, Iranians wanted to have political conversations with me. They were relentless in wanting to have political conversations with me. Like it was hilarious because I felt like they were so much more political than I ever experienced in the United States. In any case, 9/11 happens, and that's the moment the reform movement gets destroyed. Not technically, but it's within a few months of it. Khatami put out a statement saying the Islamic Republic rejects all form of terrorism, and that the Islamic Republic stands with the people of the United States, and that the Islamic Republic is willing to give aid and help to the United States in any way it can provide it. Well, the Bush administration immediately contacted the Khatami people and said, we have something that we need from you. We're going to invade Afghanistan, but we don't initially want to put troops on the ground. We want Afghans to fight. So Afghanistan had been in a civil war really since the Soviet Union had been defeated. Not immediately, but almost immediately afterwards. And by the time we got to 2001, the Northern Alliance was all that was left of the guys fighting against the government. The Taliban were in charge. The Northern Alliance owned 15-20% of Afghanistan. In the north, Mazar-e-Sharif was basically their capital. And right before 9/11 happened, the Taliban killed the leader of the Northern Alliance. I want to say it was September 10, and then 9/11 was like the next day. So clearly they knew something was coming. and they were trying to decapitate the Northern Alliance preemptively. So the United States contacted Iran because Iran was funding and supporting the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance was effectively Iran's anti-Taliban proxy force in Afghanistan. So the United States told Iran, we want them to do a lot of the ground fighting for us. Will you basically put us in contact? And Iran said, yeah, an enemy of an enemy is a friend, which, by the way, is one of the worst ideas ever. Usually an enemy of an enemy is just another guy who hates your guts and wants to kill you too. Stop with this, an enemy of an enemy is a friend. It's not true. Maybe a friend of a friend is a friend. That might work, but the other way isn't very good. In any case, Iran gave the United States the contact info for the Northern Alliance, told the Northern Alliance to cooperate with the United States, and what Khatami and his reformers thought was, this is the moment we can bring, by being on the same side in the same war with the United States, this is a moment we can end all of the pain from the past, and we don't have to shout death to America in the streets anymore, and we can then follow through with the reform movement. And so that was September 11, right? Iran was probably contacted on September 12 because we knew we were attacking Afghanistan right away. In January of 2002, George Bush Jr. gave the State of the Union address. And he said there is an axis of evil that goes from North Korea to Iran to Iraq. And in that moment, all the hardliners in the Islamic Republic went, that's what happens when you work with the great Satan. And the reform movement had the rug pulled out from underneath it, because in that moment then, the hardliners used Khatami's cooperation with the United States as an excuse to undermine his power.
Okay. Let's move ahead, because Ahmadinejad comes, and I think he's voted in precisely because the hardliners are they have wind in their sails because of Khatami's failed sort of experiment because of George Bush. And by now, there's a big strategic victory that's starting to occur for Iran, and that's through the vacuum that's created in the war in Iraq, Iran is able to be a power breaker in Iraq, so eventually they get there's a president who eventually takes power in Iraq, who in many ways is more accountable to Tehran than Washington eventually. That's not always the case, but it's the case for a large part of it. And then secondly, once the war in Syria starts, very soon, Iran is able to activate, or not soon, but later on when the conflict gets really bad in 2014, 2015, is able to activate both Hezbollah and a lot of those Iraqi militia in Iraq that are funded and are basically loyal to Tehran to kind of, influence that war in Syria in a large way. But at the same time, we get to a point where there's Ahmadinejad is eventually out of power, and, Obama opens up another channel with the Iranians and they end up signing a nuclear deal. That eventually gets torn up by Trump. It's not reinstituted by Biden, and now we're in a war, right? And there's a lot of things. I think we're in a war because of those things, but also because of October 7th, right? Like, I think that's a very big part of it, because suddenly Israel is now this massive player in the Middle East that's flexing beyond Gaza and the West Bank in ways that, and Lebanon, in ways that we probably never dreamed of it like 5 years ago. So just, I've kind of given the fast forward to it, but just add some meat onto what I've said, and then maybe let's start getting to why that nuclear deal was so important, what some of its details were, and how stupid it was of Trump to tear up.
All right, so we learned a lesson from North Korea. In 1992, North Korea announced they were going to make the nuke. So it was an election year. George Bush Sr. is president. He decides he's not even going to mess with it because he wants to see who wins the election, because it might not even be his problem if he loses. And sure enough, he loses. Bill Clinton wins. So in 1993, Bill Clinton tells North Korea, if you make the nuke, we will bomb your country into the Stone Age. You need to come to the negotiation tables. And they did. North Korea, South Korea, United States, Japan, Russia, and China sat down and worked out a deal. The deal included sending North Korea food, energy, and then the United States eventually building nuclear power plants for North Korea that wouldn't allow you to make weapons-grade uranium out of them. They would be nuclear power plants that the way to think of them is they produce energy, but there's no way to weaponize them. They're sort of spayed and neutered nuclear power plants. The ground was supposed to be broken on those nuclear power plants in 2001. And of course, everybody at the negotiating table assumed Al Gore was going to be the president in 2001. Instead, we had George Bush Jr., who tore up the treaty and threw it in everybody's face and said, I'm not breaking ground on your stupid nuclear power plants. North Korea then went, fine, we're going to make the nuke. And they did. And the lesson I thought the world would have learned from that was make a deal to get them to not make the nuke. It's just that simple. George Bush Jr. in his infinite stupidity came back to the negotiating tables with the North Koreans after they made the nuke and was trying to work out a deal. And then his presidency ended. They didn't finish the deal. And then Obama came in and he had to pick up where the pieces were. And it took him years. Kim Jong-il died. Kim Jong-un took over. They made the deal. Like 3 months later, North Korea launched a satellite. Obama ripped up the treaty and threw it in his face. They already had the nuke. Why were you making a treaty anyway? It's too late. It's like trying to get an abortion after the baby's born. Like, forget about it. What the hell? Anyway, so the Obama administration, I think, felt like it was a really good idea to get a treaty with Iran over the nuke. Iran, like you said, ended up becoming a major player because George Bush Jr. decided he was going to take Iraq down yet another notch. He was going to take it from extremely weak to destroyed completely. And he blows it up. And, you know, Iraq is 60% Shia, so a lot of Shia Arabs felt kinship with Iran. And you're right. For the most part, the Iraqi governments have been very sympathetic to Iran. At one point, they had a hung election, and this was early. George Bush was still president of the United States. And the first people they went to talk to, the two candidates in the hung election, was Iran. Then they went and talked to the Saudis. And then they went and talked to the United States to see if they could work out a deal to figure out who the next president should be. I mean, that was all you needed to know about who won the U.S. wars with Iraq. It was Iran that won them. So Iran ends up in this really powerful position. And then, of course, like you said, Syria blows up. What ends up happening when Syria breaks down is Syria did that enemy of an enemy thing. When the United States invaded Iraq, Al-Qaeda became the main force fighting the United States in the beginning. But what ended up happening was the United States talked all the other militias that were potentially going to be against the United States into siding with it and defeating Al-Qaeda. When they did that, Al-Qaeda then retreated to Syria. And Bashar al-Assad, in a moment of stupidity, allowed them to operate in Syria, thinking they could be useful at some point down the road to fight the United States in Iraq. And what ended up happening was they morphed into something I don't think anybody understood at the moment was they were going to morph into, which was ISIL. And they were actually kicked out of Al-Qaeda because they were so violent and so nasty. And they ended up conquering about a third of Syria and about half of Iraq, land-wise, not population-wise. The northern third of Syria minus some Kurdish territory and northern half of Iraq minus some Kurdish territory. They were actually in the process of surrounding Baghdad. It looked like Baghdad was going to fall to them. And the United States and Iran literally invaded Iraq and defeated ISIL. And then those Iranian forces that were in Iraq also went to Syria. And then the United States went to Syria. And so the United States and Iran were actually on the same side, fighting the same enemy. And at one point actually were coordinating. General Soleimani that the Trump administration murdered in their first term was actually the general working with the United States to fight the monster the United States created when it attacked Iraq. And yet we felt no loyalty to him, even though we had been fighting side by side against this terrible terrorist organization that we created through our violence. In any case, Iran then ends up in this really interesting position where it has extraordinary influence over Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and then the Houthis rise up in Yemen, and now it even has influence in Yemen. And I think the Iranian policymakers must have thought, we're on top of the world. We're beating Saudi Arabia in the influence game. The Saudis then get involved in this terrible civil war in Yemen, and the Houthis aren't being defeated, even if the Saudis aren't being defeated, like it's a stalemate again. But at least Iran is tying up those Saudi resources and Saudi influence somewhere else. The Obama administration ends up losing Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, which was one of the best things that happened to the Obama administration. When she left the position of Secretary of State, the United States was actually on the brink, potentially, of starting World War III over Syria. And John Kerry replaced her. John Kerry was in Iceland giving a speech and taking questions from a journalist when one of the journalists said, "Is there a way we can avoid a war in Syria?" And John Kerry said, "Yeah, why not? All they have to do is hand over their chemical weapon production facilities." And like his phone lights up in his pocket, and it's Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, going, "I can make that happen." And John Kerry is like, "Wait, what?" And peace accidentally broke out, and Syria turned over its chemical weapon production facilities to the United States, and we didn't start World War III over Syria. And so there was this moment I had, a fleeting moment, but it was a moment of hope, because suddenly the United States had a Secretary of State who was interested in peace and making deals, and so he began working on a deal for Iran. Here's what the thinking was behind the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. If you could get Iran not to make the nuke, it would buy time. In that time, the thinking that people like Kerry had was it would allow the temperature in relations between the United States and Iran to cool off. And as that temperature went down and you started to trade, started to normalize relations, eventually the sort of hostility between the two states would go away. The long-term thinking was it would then make it so Iran didn't have a priority of making the nuke, and then maybe it would create breathing space to allow a reform movement to kick back in. And eventually you would see the Islamic Republic liberalize a little bit and normalize relations, at least to a degree. I don't think anybody thought it was, going to solve everything. But it was like a 10, 20, 30-year plan. There was no expectation anything was going to happen immediately. The JCPOA, which was signed in 2015, made it so that it was essentially impossible for Iran to get the nuke for 15 years. So maybe they could get it in 2025. That was the unlikely scenario, but 2030 was the expected time that they would be able to get the nuke. And the thinking was 15 years is a long time. You can get a lot of work done. So that's why the JCPOA happened. The fact that the JCPOA happened was really a miracle. I still don't get how John Kerry, he must be really good at acrobatics. He must have had his foot behind the back of his head at one point, because the kind of twists and turns that were required to make that treaty work, it was a stunning piece of negotiating. I don't think we've had many occasions like that in human history. He deserved a prize, maybe not the Nobel Peace Prize, but he deserved the Impossible Treaty Prize, whatever that would have been. Anyway, the Islamic Republic was really keen to do this because one of the pieces in that puzzle was that the United States was going to release frozen assets. The United States had billions of dollars in Iranian money that it had frozen, and the United States had a partial embargo on Iran. So the Islamic Republic's economy was really stagnant, and the government was really keen to get that money, and so it was willing to play along, and it kept getting, A+ marks every time the weapons inspectors would go check out their facilities. And then came Trump.
Do you really think that after October 7th, realistically speaking, is it avoidable then, like given the real politics of the world, not justice or international law, but just given the real politics of the world, where there's a state called Israel that's really out of control, and there's the US imperialist state called the USA which supports it. Do you think it was avoidable?
I mean, I guess it's a good question, because I don't know that I know the answer to that. Israel is so unhinged and so out of control, and its reaction to everything is so violent and so over the top. And that's their modus operandi. They think if they become unpredictable and violent, that nobody will resist them. And of course, it's not true. Everybody still resists them as best as they can, which just makes them go even crazier, because they think, oh, we have to go even crazier. So, the number I've seen recently for the number of people dead in Gaza is 75,000, but that's the official number. Study after study I've seen suggests that the number is going to be much larger when they pull the bodies out of the rubble. Israel flattened Gaza and massacred at least 75,000 people, and the world doesn't seem to really have cared. Like, there was a little bit of maybe not so brutal, but nothing serious. Germany's still sending weapons and money to Israel. Britain's still sending weapons and money. United States still sending weapons. Like, nothing changed. The flow of violence from Europe and the United States to Israel continued. And I think what that did was that told Netanyahu, man, I can do anything, and I can get away with anything. Then in 2024, he attacked Lebanon. And when I was there last summer, my friend, I went with a friend who also lives here in UAE. We met up there, and he's Lebanese, and he was like, I'm going to take you on a tour. And so we drove to the Bekaa Valley because we wanted to go to Baalbek for obvious reasons, but also we went in the middle of Hezbollah territory, went to a wine tasting place, right? So like, if they're Muslim fanatics, then why are they allowing wine tasting in the Bekaa Valley? It sounds to me like they're just tolerant, and that they accept that they live in a multi-religious place, and they're okay with Christians having wine in the Bekaa Valley. Anyway, so as we're going across, he goes, see this bridge here? And I'm like, yeah. Israel blew this up in 2006, but the Italians rebuilt it as a gift to Lebanon. I'm like, okay. We go a little further. He goes, see this building here? Yeah. Israel blew this up in 2024. And like, that was a huge part of the tour, was, see this block here in the middle of this town? Yeah. The Israelis blew this up last year, but Hezbollah rebuilt it already. And it was this insane, like, what does Lebanon have to go through on a daily basis? And while I was in Beirut, the Israelis bombed Beirut. I walked out on the balcony and took a photo of the column of smoke, black smoke rising. That's a fraction of what Israel does to Palestine on a regular basis. Like, Lebanon gets hell, but the Palestinians get hell plus. So it's at some level, it's incomprehensible to me, the way that the Israeli state operates. But here's the other part of it. There are 14 million Palestinians. 2 million live in Israel and have Israeli citizenship. 3.5 million live in West Bank and have no citizenship. 2 million live in Gaza and have no citizenship. And then the rest are in Canada and Australia and Syria and Egypt and UAE and Mexico, right? I mean, they're scattered throughout the world. And the world doesn't care that there's this unsolvable, intractable disaster, humanitarian disaster that has taken a whole nation and turned it into a bunch of refugees. Because even the population living in Gaza and West Bank, most of them aren't from Gaza and the West Bank. They're refugees within Palestine. And so I guess the reason I'm saying all this is, if the world isn't moved by that, and you're Netanyahu, you're hearing, I can literally do anything. And he wants a war with Iran. He hated the JCPOA. But here's the thing I don't understand. Having Iran was really good business for Israel. It's the boogeyman that you can point to. It's far enough away they can't actually attack you, right? I mean, what are they going to do? Invade Iraq and Jordan? Like, I I don't understand what that war even looks like. And then, walking from Jordan to Iraq, not only can you just shoot them to pieces with airplanes, they'll just die from dehydration because there's no water. So like, there's no way to do that kind of a war. So they were the perfect enemy, the perfect boogeyman. The United States already had villainized them and was filled with hatred for them. And you could say, oh, Israel is under threat, they'll destroy us. And then go ask for billions of dollars in aid from Germany and Great Britain and the United States and get it. And so attacking them and trying to do a regime change seems like a really dumb idea for the Israelis, because why would they want to get rid of their boogeyman? It's a perfect relationship. And the Islamic Republic can go, oh, Israel's evil, we're going to stand up for the Palestinians, and then do a bunch of not much. A little bit of aid to Hamas, a little bit of aid to Hezbollah. So it was also good for the Islamic Republic. Like they needed each other. They were in this symbiotic hate fest. But I think what happened was Netanyahu had drunk his own Kool-Aid and began to believe his own bullshit so much that he decided he really needed to do this war. So 9 months ago, he does the 12-day war. And then 24 days ago, he starts this 24-day long war. And I guess he knew he could get away with it both times because of Trump. Anthony Blinken came out and said that after the Trump guys had talked about this, Anthony Blinken came out and said that Netanyahu had tried to get Obama to do this war and had tried to get Biden to do it, and that both presidents had resisted. They were like, no, we're not going to do this. So Netanyahu knew he had the guy that he needed in the office in the form of Trump. And he was right? Trump had said he wasn't going to attack in the 12-day war. Israel attacked, and then Trump suddenly attacked. And then this war, you're right. According to the Omanis, they were about to make a breakthrough in the negotiating and create like a new JCPOA. And in fact, there are some members of the United States State Department who have backed up that sentiment and have said, yeah, we were close to a deal. And that was on Friday. So that was the 27th of February. And the negotiations broke off for the weekend. And, Trump had been saying he's going to attack for days. So I actually did office hours. We recorded it on Monday, but we released it on Thursday, where I said, I think there's a high probability that there's going to be a war. And I also talked about some of the stuff that I had gotten from insiders. So apparently the Trump guys had actually contacted Iran in either late January or early February and had said, we're going to bomb you. We're going to hit some infrastructure. We'll tell you the locations in advance to make sure your leadership isn't there. And we will tolerate you hitting some of our bases in the region like you did in the 12-day war when you attacked our base in Qatar. And the Iranians responded by saying, if you do this, we will hit everything in the Middle East. We are going to go, it's going to be a full-on war. We will include Israel. We'll include all your military bases. Nobody's off limits. So in other words, if I knew this the Monday before the war started, I would hope that there were people in the United States government, there were people in the Israeli government who also had known this, especially since it was the Trump guys who had this conversation. You would think they would have heard the other end of the reply end. So when I woke up on Saturday, we were staying in a hotel in Abu Dhabi. I saw the headline. I was like, oh, this is gonna be really, really bad. And I was on my computer, I was writing, and I hear boom, and I jumped up, ran to the balcony. You could see the column of smoke. I knew immediately it was Iran responding. They had told the world they were going to, or at least the Trump administration, they were going to do this. And sure enough, they did. And they've been fighting back. The crazy thing is, I think that the Trump guys and Netanyahu actually believed if you killed Khamenei, the government would collapse. This is, Nietzsche says that everything the state says is a lie, and everything that it is stolen. And okay, that's great. But what's amazing to me is how often the state starts to believe its own set of lies. Like, it's ridiculous to assume that an assassination is going to bring down a whole government. I mean, when we overthrew al-Qawatli in 1949, we plunged Syria into chaos. I'm not saying it might not have some kind of effect, but when Kennedy was assassinated, the United States didn't collapse. When Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, Austria-Hungary didn't collapse right away. It took 4 years and a world war. You know what I mean? Like, there's no evidence anywhere that if you kill one guy, you're going to bring down the entire state apparatus. And I think that's the part that baffles me, that they did this with no plan.
I mean, I've been speaking to, obviously, on the show and to many people who've been thinking about this for a long time. So our own staff, our editors, actually met with the Iranian ambassador in the UK 6 months ago as well, and he said if there's a few more attacks, there's another attack, we will attack Dubai, and we will attack every single base in the region, in all of these Gulf countries. And so definitely, I mean, I think Netanyahu and Trump knew this. I don't know if Trump took it seriously. I did think that what you're saying is true regarding Trump, that he was drinking his own Kool-Aid, and he thought that, if you take out Khamenei, you'll have some sort of regime change or regime collapse. And he was kind of doing a Maduro version 2.0. But I think with Netanyahu, I think it's the Franz Ferdinand thing. I think he wants to, or more specifically, it's the Qawatli thing. I think he wants to actually plunge Iran into chaos. And I think he wants to see the GCC's relationship with America come under scrutiny. And he wants to see them weakened economically. I think Netanyahu wants a bunch of weak states around Israel. He wants every state around Israel to be like Lebanon, if they're not like Jordan, if they're not compliant and listening and buying gas from Israel at whatever price they can, and allowing Israel to monopolize their peace, their resources, or any other way, they will end up being Lebanon. And I just think that's his vision. I think he doesn't care. I think he doesn't care at all about. It's fine if the price of oil goes up, and those are the things that counterbalances him, because it's not the UN. It's not going to be France or Germany or the UK or the USA. It's going to be, can the world afford this war? Is NVIDIA getting too upset because its chips now cost too much or can't get anywhere? And those are actually the levers, unfortunately, that seem to be holding Netanyahu.
I mean, I can see that. And I think at some level, Netanyahu thinks he's going to create greater Israel, right? Like Putin thinks he's going to put the Soviet Union back together, and Netanyahu thinks he's going to create greater Israel. And I think it's going to go the other direction at this point, because I think Iran has all the cards. If Iran keeps the Strait of Hormuz shut down and keeps hitting the oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar and Kuwait, there's nothing that the United States or Israel can do to dig Iran out. If they put soldiers on Hark Island, it's like the dumbest idea the world has ever heard. Yes, it'll shut down Iran's ability to sell oil. All they'll do is fly drones and missiles into those soldiers relentlessly. I have a friend who said this on another podcast. It'll be another case on, where the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam is one outpost too close to North Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese pounded those Marines. And that's what Hark Island will be. It'll just be this barrel we put Marines in so they could get shot. I just can't comprehend how they think they're going to extract themselves from this. Trump said, we're going to, on day 3, the Iranians have been reaching out to me. They want to secretly negotiate. I'm happy to do it. And then the Iranians immediately put out a statement going, no, there's no such negotiations going on. He lives in such a weird fantasy that I think in his mind, it may be he really does believe the Iranians have reached out to him, even when the Iranians don't reach out to him. And I think also he's distracting from the Epstein files. I think you're right. He thinks this is Maduro 2.0. I think he feels burned on Greenland, so he's trying to get that bitter taste out. So he was looking for a win somewhere. I think he doesn't know anything about geography, so he doesn't know about the Strait of Hormuz, or that Iran is 3 times bigger than Iraq, and that Iraq beat the United States after 8 years of warfare and humiliated the United States. I think he doesn't understand all the parts involved and all the pieces, and he's just following Netanyahu. But now what? I mean, if I were Iran, I would make sure that Israel and the United States never attacked me again. And I think the only way to do that is to plunge the world into a recession or a depression, or force the United States to give up some serious concessions, like no more bases in the Persian Gulf.
I don't think they'd agree to that. But I mean, they may not agree to that. They never agree to that. But I don't think their host countries are going to make it easy for them to rebuild those bases. I mean, I don't think they have much autonomy in that particular matter. But I don't think, I can see that. I mean, the thing is, whenever I speak to, it's true. Like the U.S. strategically lost Vietnam and they strategically lost Iraq War. But the thing is, I think and you don't, but many other people do kind of, at the same time, Iran's degradation is going to put the country back 15 years, if not more. They're going to lose key infrastructure, its ability to pump out its oil, its gas. It's the same with these rich GCC countries. I mean, just Qatar, which is the richest GCC country around, just that strike, which was very light on Ras Laffan, has seriously impacted their revenue for a long time and will for a long time. Yeah. And so it really weakens the nation.
It's going to mess up Europe.
Yes, exactly. And so it weakens. It like everyone loses. Like the world will be plunged into a massive depression or recession. But the those in the front line, which at the moment is Iran and the GCC, not Israel, even though there are bombs falling on Israel, it's not really impacting major key infrastructure projects yet, or income revenue projects. And so it's just a bit of a difficult thing. But we have reached the 2 hours which you have given me. So I guess it's more or less the end. Just some closing remarks. Yeah, I know you probably have a few ideas, so just go for it.
Yeah, if I were the GCC states, I would be looking to replace the United States with China. Right now I would be asking myself, why do we have these bases here? Why are we allied with these maniacs that support genocide? Like there's no benefit at this moment in my mind for the GCC to have U.S. bases. I mean, one of the reasons why the United States wanted those bases was so that they could build an early warning system for Israel in case Iran launched missiles. The first thing Iran did was blow up those early warning bases. So Israel doesn't have its early warning system. But then if you're the GCC, you're thinking, wait, so we're getting bombed so that the early warning systems can be knocked out? There must be a calculus going on. And either that or I think Qatar should have given Trump 2 $400 billion airplanes. $400 million airplanes.
Or maybe $1 billion.
One clearly wasn't. Yeah, the billion might have really brought it home. The problem is he has amnesia and is incapable of loyalty, right? So it doesn't matter how much you send him. I think people think if I just send enough gifts to the emperor will start to feel something for me. It's not true.
No emperor has ever done this. No crazy emperor has ever behaved this way.
No.
Yes.
He has no concept of loyalty or that he owes people. He believes the world owes him. He thought he could be Pope. This guy is operating in a different plane of existence than the rest of us.
Okay, excellent. Professor Roy Casagrande, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll be in touch again at some point to speak about something.
All right, thanks so much, Ash.
Excellent, thank you.